Welcome back to The Explainer. Today, we are diving into a literal pivot point in global affairs, the 2026 G7 summit in Evian. You know, when the leaders of the free world get together, the ripples are felt everywhere. But this particular summit, wow, it represented a massive shifting of geopolitical tectonic plates. We're talking major peace deals, shifting war strategies, fierce economic standoffs, and some seriously intense local pushback. Let's just jump right in. Okay, so we're going to unpack this massive event through 5 major themes. First up, the 2026 Evian summit itself, then the new Iran peace deal, navigating the Ukraine war, global trade and tariffs, and finally, the heavy security and protests.
All right, Section 1, the 2026 Evian Summit, a historic return to the French lakeside.
Now, this marks the 52nd G7 summit, but the history here is actually pretty fascinating. Evian is now the very first French town to host this massive international event twice. They previously hosted the G8 way back in 2003. French President Emmanuel Macron specifically chose this picturesque location on the shores of Lake Geneva, right near the Swiss border, to serve as a kind of diplomatic capstone for his final term in office. It's definitely a setting that commands attention.
And the scale of this thing was completely unprecedented. Beyond the core G7 members, President Macron really opened the doors wide. He brought in key players from the Middle East, Africa, and South America to tackle these deeply intertwined global issues. But the biggest standout? This marked Syria's first-ever attendance at a G7 summit. I mean, that is a huge shift in diplomatic engagement, and it really set the tone for everything else that followed.
Moving right along to Section 2, the Iran peace deal, and the question of whether we're entering a new era in the Middle East.
So, what exactly is in the U.S.-Iran agreement? That was the big question everyone was asking as the leaders touched down. Look, the U.S. and Iran have been locked in this grinding 3.5-month conflict that has just rattled the Middle East and sent absolute shockwaves through the global economy. But then, the breakthrough hit. A memorandum of understanding is set to be officially signed in Switzerland to finally bring this conflict to a close.
So how does this actually work? Well, it relies on a very strict operational timeline. First, they sign the Memorandum of Understanding. Step 2 implements a critical 60-day ceasefire window just to cool the immediate tensions. But Step 3 is the absolute game-changer for the global economy, reopening the Strait of Hormuz to toll-free shipping. That strait is a vital artery for global oil and gas supplies that Iran had effectively shut down. In exchange for opening it back up, the U.S. ordered an end to its blockade on Iranian ports. France and the UK are even working on a maritime mission to help secure that strait, which really just shows you how high the stakes are for global energy markets right now.
Driving this deal from the American side was U.S. President Donald Trump, and he summarized his main objective super bluntly. He stated, "The one thing that's happening that's of note, frankly, the only thing that really matters to me, is Iran will never have a nuclear weapon." So you can clearly see the U.S. strategy here pivots heavily away from the immediate, localized conflict and focuses squarely on long-term nuclear deterrence as the ultimate end goal.
All right, on to Section 3, navigating the Ukraine war, shifting front lines, and diplomatic deadlocks. Now, when it came to Ukraine, a pretty stark contrast in diplomatic priorities emerged. On one hand, you have the European stance, championed by the UK, Germany, and France. They are pushing for the US to mediate peace talks with Russia, but they absolutely insist on having direct European involvement at the negotiating table. Which makes sense, right? They're providing massive financial and military backing to the region. On the flip side, the US stance under President Trump seeks to shift focus past the war entirely. He cited the death toll as ridiculous and is pushing for a rapid deal so that economic sanctions on Russia might eventually be lifted. And right in the middle of this, Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky arrived in person with a crystal-clear message: Ukraine is no longer losing momentum. But to sustain that, he came with some highly specific, urgent requests. He asked for more Patriot missiles to guard their power grids from Russian barrages, licensing to actually produce weapons locally, and a major crackdown on Russia's shadow fleet of oil ships that they use to evade international sanctions. And interestingly, the UK actually announced new sanctions targeting that exact evasion network during the summit, giving Zelensky some immediate backing on that front.
Let's shift gears to Section 4, Global Trade and Tariffs, looking at the economic undercurrents and tensions.
100%. Yeah, you heard that right. That staggering number represents the massive tariffs the U.S. threatened to slap on French wine. And the reason why? Well, Paris implemented a digital tax that targeted American tech giants. The U.S. basically warned they'd have no choice but to apply these tariffs unless that digital tax was dropped. It perfectly highlights these deep, ongoing transatlantic trade disputes over exactly how we're supposed to regulate and tax the modern digital economy. Zooming out a bit, French President Emmanuel Macron presented this incredibly memorable formula to explain the broader global instability. He said, China overproduces, the United States overconsumes, and Europe underinvests. It is just a perfectly succinct way of telling the G7 that fixing global trade imbalances isn't just about throwing tariffs on wine or tech. It literally requires a fundamental shift in behavior from all three of those major global markets.
And finally, Section 5, Heavy Security and Protests. Let's look at the local reality of global diplomacy.
Just wrap your head around this number, 16,000. That's the amount of police officers, gendarmes, military personnel, and customs agents mobilized on the French side alone just to lock down the region. I mean, they had boats patrolling Lake Geneva, drones in the sky, dog units sweeping the ground. They set up 2 massive security perimeters to strictly control who could even move around the town.
And as you might guess, a lockdown of that magnitude quickly escalated into a cross-border crisis. Back in May, the Swiss president actually wrote to Macron expressing some deep concerns about the massive security burden falling on Switzerland, specifically Geneva, since they share the lake. By June 10th, Switzerland literally had to temporarily reinstate border controls with France and restrict their own airspace. The very next day, local railways and ferry terminals in Evian were totally shut down. It sparked some very real political friction between the two nations over who exactly bears the cost and the massive disruption of global diplomacy.
And unfortunately, those Swiss concerns were completely validated. A broad activist coalition called No G7 organized demonstrations right in Geneva. On June 14th, which also coincided with the annual Swiss feminist strike, a massive crowd of 20,000 demonstrators marched through the city. While it initially started out as a peaceful event, the situation eventually fractured. Clashes violently broke out near the United Nations building, and police urgently had to deploy tear gas and water cannons to regain control of the streets.
So we've seen sweeping global agreements right alongside some really intense local fallout, which leaves us with a vital question to consider. With power dynamics rapidly shifting and local disruptions growing so severe, are massive centralized global summits like the G7 still the most effective way to shape our world's future? It's definitely something to think about. Thanks so much for joining me for this explainer, and I'll see you in the next one.